Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. I have a fairly dense presentation here, and it's already getting late in the evening. So I'm going to try to get through my comments relatively quickly so we can get to these extremely interesting panelists. I've already chatted a bit with some of them, and frankly, I'm more interested in what they have to say than what I have to say. But I did want to, again, express my thanks to NASW for being here tonight, but for all I learned at the tutelage of many of the people in this room. Paul, congratulations on your Lifetime Award, and my other professors who are here tonight. And if I've seen at all far, it's because I've stood on your shoulders. I did make that comment on the Marr show because it's something I've always thought to be the case. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had at the very highest levels of political and policy power where I can tell I'm talking to people who haven't spent enough time in actual neighborhoods where people are trying to get by. And when I said something about social work as a requirement for a preparation of an economics career, Bill Marr said, "Yeah, but there's no money in that." To which I didn't have a good response. But there should be. I wanted to talk to you about something that strikes me as more and more germane to what I think we're all about here. Many of the people in this room, on this panel, Elizabeth, for example, who I was chatting with, work with people on the ground who need your help every day. And I consider that to be not only the Lord's work, but incredibly important in addressing the problems of poverty and disadvantage and racism and sexism and so many of the difficulties that these populations face. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the context within which all of that exists. The market failures, if you will, the problems within our economy through, quote, good times and bad that lead to the challenges that folks in this room face on a daily basis, whether you're teaching students who are going into the field or whether you're in the field yourself. If we don't examine and think of ways to address these systemic problems, I learned about systems back in Hunter, then our work will never, ever be done. And I learned that really good social work obviates itself, makes itself unnecessary. And so this is the economic, 'cause I'm an economist now, but this is the economic context within which our work exists. And it's not just a bunch of facts and figures, although they're definitely in here. For years, I presented facts and figures. I wrote numerous books that were facts and figures. The State of Working America, I've written, co-wrote 9 editions with various co-authors, and that's 500 pages of tables and graphs and analysis and regressions and all of that good stuff. And that's fine, and that's important, but it is not enough. It is not enough. It is time to get back on offense. To stop playing defense, to figure out what's gone wrong and what social workers and other sane people can do about it. That begins with a diagnosis. Now, some of these slides, if you can't see them, don't worry. They're mostly there for me, so I can just keep myself kind of organized here. But when I think about what's gone wrong in the very benighted town where I live now, which is Washington, D.C., I think about how we have really, at least at the level of national policy, forgotten, unlearned how to diagnose what's wrong and to prescribe how to fix it. And So I thought it would be smart to start with this diagnosis of the biggest problems we face. And from an economic perspective, again, I think that the key word there is a disconnection, a disconnection. This is not new, by the way, and again, people here have been talking about this and living this and explaining this and working with the consequences of this for decades. Disconnections between growth, productivity, jobs, wages, poverty. I'll show you a picture of it. What you're seeing there is the growth of productivity, which is output, like GDP, the output that our economy creates every year per hour. So every year, think of it this way, if you're working in a factory and you produce 10 widgets this year, and I should say you produce 10 widgets this week and 11 widgets next week, your productivity went up by 10% because with the same amount of work you produced more output. Now productivity, they'll teach you in economics, is synonymous with living standards. As productivity rises, living standards rises. That's really what you're taught. And in fact, analytically, it kind of makes sense. If we're creating more output per hour, we ought to be able to enjoy increasing living standards. But who's we? Between 1947 or so and the mid-70s, actually, we all did kind of grow together. And then look what happened. There's a huge diversion there. Now this is the hourly compensation of middle wage workers. If I showed you low wage workers, you can imagine that that would look even more divergent. But starting in the mid-70s, after growing in lockstep for decades, productivity and compensation diverge. And you see that real gaping kind of wound there in those two lines. And why is that? It has to do with this phenomenon of economic income, wage, and wealth inequality. Inequality. The benefits of growth no longer flowing broadly to folks across the income scale, but much more isolated. Now, there were groups who were not benefiting back in the 40s and 50s either. Let's be clear about that. It wasn't exactly I don't mean to suggest that there weren't deep problems, particularly in discrimination in those years as well. But certainly on average, productivity of the median worker not attract their compensation. So what the heck happened? What explains that divergence? And here's why it's so important. Because if growth fails to reach middle and lower income people, then any kind of linkage between improving the economy and lowering poverty rates goes away. We have what economists call sticky poverty rates. And it's actually one of the things that got me interested in this work. In the 1980s, when the inequality story was becoming clear, you can kind of see that taking off there. There was this delinkage, there's that word disconnect again, delinkage between productivity or GDP growth, economic growth, and poverty rates. They were sticky in the 90s. And if poverty rates are sticky, then you can have politicians all day standing up there on the dais saying, this will lead to more growth, and this will lead to more jobs, and this will improve productivity. Okay, maybe it will. Half the time it won't, but that's a different story. Maybe it will. But if it doesn't reach many of the folks who are actually contributing, sort of the bakers of the pie who are ending up with smaller slices, something fundamentally is broken. What are the causes of inequality? Again, I don't expect you to read this. Maybe you can see the bold words. I only have this here because it's often, once you start talking about someone's, very legitimately, you can raise their hand and say, okay, well, how did that happen? There's a lot of reasons. This is not one perpetrator. That's not, bad guy, Ronald Reagan or something like that. Not at all. This is a bunch of structural and political and power changes. Increased globalization has played a role, particularly import penetration from lower wage countries. There's diminished unionization. I wrote a column about that on my blog today. Higher unemployment, which has been and continues to be a real problem. That was kind of the motivation for the op-ed that ran in the Times the other day, where I proposed a full employment program, which I'll talk about in a minute. Ongoing technological change, which displaces workers with less education. And this is important. I have a little thing in caps there because I'm going to get back to that. There is some thinking, and it's important for my work, and I think for yours as well, there's some thinking that while this idea that technology has contributed to the displacement of some workers over time, certainly that's a well-known story, but in fact, there's been enough intervening stuff going on so that people weren't as badly displaced or permanently displaced as all that. Well, there's some thinking recently that the pace at which labor-saving technology is entering the job market has increased. So think about robotics a little bit, and you'll maybe get an impression that this issue of ongoing technical change displacing workers and contributing to those income gaps may be accelerating. The decline in the real value of the minimum wage, and to his credit, the president has proposed an increase in the minimum wage. He hasn't talked about it enough, but at least he proposed it. Regressive changes in the tax code, financial deregulation. We're about a few blocks from where a lot of that takes place. All this, quote, innovation and the increased financialization of industry, that's contributed to inequality as well. So there's a disconnect, as I showed you, productivity, jobs, wages. And I've given you some reasons for why that's occurred. And I must say that for many years in my career, the talk kind of almost ended there. Say, oh, you've got a problem, here's some pictures of it, here's why I think it's happening. Thank you and good luck. I have realized that, obviously, that's inadequate, but in a particular way. And it's the third bullet there, the relationship between the inequality of income and the inequality of opportunity. And let me tell you why I think that's so important. As I said, for years, literally, I held up books and wrote books about these trends. And I showed these trends to people in PowerPoint graphs and in great elaboration. And I would credit Larry, Michelle, myself, some of the folks that I worked with back then, as really putting this issue on the map. I mean, it's commonly accepted now, but it wasn't back in the 80s when the Economic Policy Institute started talking about this and so on. And I often thought that it was enough to kind of describe the problem. Well, the fact is that we've always had inequality in this economy, and we always will. Capitalist economies always have some inequality. There's a matter of how much, but it's not enough to say we have inequality and it's a problem. You have to explain why. And from our perspective as social workers, I think what really matters here is the relationship between the inequality of income, which is widely accepted. I mean, we may not love it, but most people in America understand, and probably many of us do, I think I do as well, that there will always be inequality. But we do have this idea that opportunity should be equally distributed, at least at the starting gate. We don't necessarily believe everyone should end up at the same place at the end. Inequality of outcomes, sure, we accept that. Inequality of opportunity, nuh-uh. At least theoretically. Now again, I'm not naive. Inequality of opportunities has existed since this country has existed. But we do have deeply held by, and I deal with people all across the political spectrum, from I was going to say from the most far-right conservative. We'll put those aside because I don't know what those folks are thinking. But from the conservative to the liberal side of the spectrum, it is accepted that your zip code should not determine your outcome. Your parents' education should not determine how far you get. Your parents' income or wealth should not determine how far you get. Yes, it does, and in fact, it does more here than in other countries, and that should probably not a surprise to you. But what we're seeing now is how the inequality of income and wealth bleeding into and leading to a greater divergence in disparate opportunities. Here's just a few slides quickly, because I don't want to get bogged down in this, on how this plays out. This is one that I think is very intuitive. What this shows is from the early 70s to the 2000s, it shows the enrichment expenditures on your kids. Now, by enrichment expenditures, I mean what parents spend on their kids in music lessons, art lessons, books, sports, tutoring. I'm a upper middle class parent. I have 2 children, 13 and 11, and let me tell you, they do a lot of music and art lessons and sports and all that other stuff, just like every other kid in our neighborhood. And what this bottom line shows is the change in spending on enrichment kits for children, that bottom dotted line, by the lowest income quintile. the folks who are in the bottom 20% of the income scale. And that top line that shoots up there shows the spending on enrichment goods on kids in the top income quintile. The difference was a factor of 4 back in the 70s, and now it's a factor of more than 7 in the 2000s. So inequality of income leads to an inequality of investment in children. And at the same time that that's occurring, public schools are disinvesting in children. You know, you can't get the sports through the school, or in many cases, adequate music or art lessons or books through the schools. So at a time when the public contribution to these critical enrichments is diminishing, the folks who have the means to provide them for their children are going further and further apart from everyone else. I think it's a good kind of crystallizing example of the way income inequality contributes to opportunity inequality. This is another one which I won't go into. This is one that I think would really resonate with a lot of folks here. And again, maybe some of the panelists could talk about whether some of these things resonate in their work on the ground. This is from longitudinal work that follows poor and non-poor kids from families below 25,000 and above 25,000, follows them over time from when they were kids to when they're grown-ups. And what this found is that if you boost the incomes among the poorest family, that when the children who are the beneficiaries of those income boosts, when they grow up, they have considerably more earnings and hours of work than kids who didn't get that income boost. So think about the earned income tax credit. The effect of this shows the effect of a $3,000 annual increase during early childhood in your family. So you're a kid between 0 and 6, and your family all of a sudden gets the earned income tax credit. And in this research, you can compare them to families that didn't get the earned income tax credit, that are poor, and you can compare them to families who are wealthy, and they don't need the income tax credit. So you get this wage subsidy, and all of a sudden your family income goes up $3,000. You follow these kids in a longitudinal survey, and you find out when they're grown-ups, they earn more, and they're more connected to the job market. So again, an example of how, in this case, a redistributive program, a wage subsidy, that's what the earned income credit is, a very significant wage subsidy, 40% at its peak, 40% on top of your wage, helps to not only lift your family's living standards at the time, which is critical, lifts, as I'll show you in a minute, lifts a ton of people out of poverty, but has lasting impact. So for people who don't get that, the effect is I think, unfortunately, obvious. The next problem is one of inadequate job creation, and not just job quantity, but also job quality. I'll get back to that in a second. And finally, this is all part of the diagnosis. So again, diagnosis, the disconnect is the biggest thing. The disconnect and the inequality that explains that growing difference between growth and incomes and wages and poverty. The relationship between that disconnect and opportunity. I've given you just a couple of snippets of that, but we can talk more about it. There's a lot more research in that space. It's actually a very rich area of inquiry. Inadequate job creation, I'll get to that in a second. But I want to talk about this disinvestment because that's a very big deal right now in the world that I live in Washington, D.C., with all these budget battles. What's NDD and why does it matter? Well, NDD stands for non-defense discretionary. Okay, I'm sorry, it's late in the evening to be talking about such terms, but I can't help it. It's important. When you hear all these budget battles, what's really being talked about so far, for the most part, the president's talked a little bit about cutting the growth rate of entitlements, but since the Social Security and Medicare, and to some extent Medicaid and food stamps, are protected in these debates, they're somewhat insulated, especially the ones that are more universal, Medicare and Social Security, are kind of politically insulated to some extent. Well, what part of the budget do they go after? Well, to their credit, they've gone after defense a bit, but they're trying to put those cuts back. No, the thing they go after is the discretionary side of the budget. So that's the things that they appropriate funds for every year, and that's not defense. So non-defense discretionary. So what's in there? WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, that's in there. Head Start, Head Start is in there. Education and training, lots of investment. 30% non-discretionary defense goes to states for their many of those dollars end up in state education, or they help pay for teacher training, for smaller class size. This is the part of the budget that everyone's going after. When I say everyone, I'm not just talking about Republicans. Because it doesn't have the political insulation of other parts, everybody's taking a whack at it. This, I think it's blue, I'm colorblind, but the blue line there shows the path of non-defense discretionary funding as a percent of GDP from the 70s to projecting 10 years out. And the yellow line shows after sequestration, because that goes right after this, and the red line shows what would happen if the House, led by Paul Ryan, if they had their way. No matter how you cut it, whether it's the president's budget after sequestration, or Ryan, we are headed for the lowest spending on NDD in recorded history, and history goes back to the 70s. That's how far back we have the data. Now, when I worked in the White House, and I have a lot of respect and admiration for the team there, but I'm not totally uncritical, and I'm sure you are either. One of the bragging kind of talking points is we're going to bring NDD down to the lowest level as a share of the economy since Eisenhower. To which I said, nobody knows what NDD is and nobody knows what Eisenhower is. But I lost. And now it's the only part of the budget that, along with defense to some extent, although you can imagine the Hawks are trying to pull that part back, that's getting whacked. So again, I have about a four-part diagnosis here. Inequality, inequality of opportunity, job creation, and disinvestment. Now, I'm going to skip ahead here because I want to talk about some good things that are going on, and one that's very important, I think, to social work, and then a little bit about a prescription, and then sit down. So, is there anything good going on? And of course, I mean, this is probably somewhat less germane, or maybe for this audience, because so much of what you see in the economy are market failures every day. But in fact, the macroeconomy has been quite resilient, and we've hit this economy with a lot of abuse, and it does keep on ticking, even though the growth rates are definitely too slow. But here's the thing that may surprise you and may even sort of piss you off to hear me saying it. But at least by the numbers I have, this is true. The safety net has performed far better than most people realize. I myself have been surprised, at least by the numbers, how well the safety net performed. I'm not saying that it was perfect or that it was anything more than a very good Band-Aid, but a good Band-Aid is better than a bad Band-Aid or no Band-Aid at all. The blue line there on the graph on the left shows child poverty rates for the nation over the Great Recession, which was the deepest recession since the 1980s. I mean, I was there at the White House when this was going on, and we were losing 750,000, 800,000 jobs a month. So this was cataclysmic. And poverty rates for kids, as measured, went up from 18 to 22%. So that's a terrible outcome. But poverty rates are not measured the way they should be, because they don't include the benefits, many of the benefits, the earned income tax credit, food stamps, many of the benefits that many of us have fought our whole careers for. And you should count those because they make a difference, and public policy can't possibly make good judgments and good analysis without counting its impact in measures like the poverty rate. If you look at the poverty rate accounting for the full scope of benefits that were ratcheted up, partly in the Recovery Act, to help low-income people, child poverty didn't go up at all, hardly. It ticked up a few tenths of a point. The graph on the right shows how many people were removed from poverty, separating out kids by the safety net program. The earned income tax credit in 2011 removed 6 million people from poverty. Half of those were kids. SNAP, or food stamp, removed almost 5 million, about 2 million kids, etc. Unemployment insurance, same thing. The safety net performed well. What else? Something's got to give. And there is recognition by some that what we're going about is unsustainable. Where that lands is very much a function of a movement that is, in my view, not existent yet and needs to be. there is increasing concern and understanding that money in politics and the disproportionate influence of the wealthy is problematic. There is some understanding of the feedback from wealth concentration to its undue influence. There's deep frustration with dysfunctional DC and gridlock and the filibusters and all this, obsession about the Benghazi situation, the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. I was on MSNBC earlier, and someone was saying that the Republicans are going to have, I think in the House, their 40th vote to repeal the ACA. I may be wrong, but I think I'm in the ballpark. There's deep frustration with that. There's deep frustration with it. As I said, we're not at and I'll talk about this in a second in my closing remarks. We're not in a place where we, I think, have a good handle on what to do about it. But people are really frustrated and pissed off to the extent that they're paying attention with this dysfunction, including the undue influence of the top, narrow slice of the wealthiest in politics. And a lot of this is playing out in changing demographics. I mean, we had a debate today on TV about immigration reform. And the commentator was asking me, Jared, there's a new study out that shows the immigration reform bill is complicated, it's 884 pages, and this study says that immigrants will cost over $6 trillion. I said, look, the one number you need to know is 27%. Because 27% is the share of the Latino vote that Mitt Romney received. That's why we may see comprehensive immigration reform. Because the demographics are pushing politicians in that direction. I'm in the business of facts. You are in the business of facts by dint of being here and not falling asleep yet, are in the business of facts. But not everybody is. And the debate is sometimes quite horrifyingly fact-free. But once the politics lines up such that you can't ignore certain facts, if you want to keep your job, I was quite struck by this finding that the share of African American voters was higher than that of white non-Hispanic voters in 2012. Something that was just, those kinds of things matter. They matter a lot, and they give me a lot of hope. So, how do we get out of this mess? Oh, I have a typo here. Oh, sorry. That's supposed to say safety net works and is needed. So, go on. Getting on offense partly means understanding and standing up for things that we've done that have been successful. I am not saying that the safety net is working as well as it needs to, and I bet you there's many horrifying examples in this. I used to be a social worker in New York City, so I know how those things don't work, and I know how they do work. But markets fail; they fail big time, and the safety net has helped not just the lowest income people; it's helped middle income people a lot. This is a really interesting little graph. It shows that for middle income people, people in the middle fifth, their market income, putting aside just basically their wages, fell $6,000 over the Great Recession. But once you take account of transfers, which is mostly unemployment insurance for them, and decline in taxes, because progressive taxes do that in a recession, $5,000 of that loss was made back. So, the safety net helps a lot of people, and we should be proud of that. We should build on it. Yes, raise the minimum wage, but also raise the median wage. And, it's not just that we have to help poor people get on the ladder to the middle class. We have to keep middle class people from climbing that ladder the wrong way, falling down. And, as a social worker, I worked a lot with poor people, but one thing I recognized was that every single poor person I worked with, A, thought they were middle class, and B, wanted to be more middle class. Yep. And so I've always taken the median as my target, and that's why I think full employment is so important. And here's where let's get on offense on this. I mean, look, conservatives and a lot of liberals believe that in this country, if you're able-bodied, you're not disabled, and you're not of retirement age, and you're not a kid, you ought to work. That's pretty widely accepted. I mean, I'm happy to have a discussion about it, but I can tell you, in the political debate, that is widely accepted. You got to work, and I have no problem with that. I have no problem with that if there are jobs, right? if we want to have a system of social welfare for able-bodied people that's based on work, and the market isn't providing enough ample employment of a decent quality with living wages, then the government sector has the responsibility to make up the difference. This is a very simple construct. I mean, please tell me if this doesn't resonate with you, not right now. Please tell me if this doesn't resonate with you. And it's been part of the Full Employment Act of 46 and the Full Employment Act, that's 1946, and the Full Employment Act of 1978. And there's no reason why it can't be a part of the Full Employment Act of 2014 or maybe 2016 or maybe 2026. Sometimes these things have long runways, and I'm okay with that. But if you want people to work and there aren't good jobs, then we have to make sure there are good jobs for them. It's that simple. We're not going to get there without a movement. I was talking to Steve Burkhardt about this, and I think this is something that folks who've been in this business a while understand. I was reading an article the other day in the New Yorker, and I came across this little quote by George Packer, who was a writer for the New Yorker, and he was kind of suggesting that good things aren't going to happen. That's my words. Until there's an idea of the future that's genuinely shared by large numbers of people. Until there's a progressive idea of an equitable future that's genuinely shared by large numbers of people. I march in front of a parade and there are too few people behind me. I'm happy to continue to march in front of the parade with my fax and my blog and all the work I do. And I know you're up there marching with me, and I know we're all in that parade together. But there's not enough of us. We need a progressive, equitable idea of the future that's genuinely shared by large numbers of people. I suggest an economic rights frame. I'm not saying we use those words, I'm not the wordsmith here, but I suggest a frame of full employment and economic rights where economic equity, the opposite of inequality, where economic equality is not a matter of equal outcomes. This is not a Soviet 5-year plan where everybody has to end up at the same place, but where equity means not equity of outcomes or equity of income, but true equity of opportunity. True equity of opportunity. When I think of Occupy Wall Street, and we can have all kinds of conversations about what happened there. There are people in this room who are more informed about that than I was. But what really resonated with the nation was the idea that opportunity and accountability were so important and were missing for large swaths of the American people. There are slivers that get all the opportunity they want and have very little accountability. But what really is a nation, a society, an economy that I think we as social workers can believe in and help to build is an economy that has opportunity and accountability for all. To me, that's a frame, an economics right frame, which is an idea that should be shared by large numbers of people. And if you work with me, I think it will be. Thank you very much.